This one, I don't have anything necessarily to bring up and showcase, but it was just kind of tagging off of a little bit of a discussion that you and I, Danny, had with our other co-host, Tobias. We're just kind of talking the other day about basically when to use entity command buffers versus when not to use them. And so this kind of all came about because actually Tobias and I were working on a project together, and I was kind of using entity command buffers quite a bit. I think it was just kind of like a habit that I started getting into because, especially going through, a lot of the Unity's resources that they've kind of put out there, and best practice recommendations and everything like that, it really seemed like, entity command buffers were something that you should kind of use a lot because you can kind of, queue up operations and then, play those back at a later time. But kind of we were discussing that actually might not always be the most efficient, way to go about things. So again, just kind of wanted to open this up, and I know you have some pretty good knowledge and insights about, when entity command buffers should be used versus when not to. So I guess we can just kind of start this conversation by saying, is there kind of like a general rule of thumb about, when
Um,
you should use an entity command buffer versus not, or what?
yeah, so like my general rule of thumb is just you should never use an NC command buffer. But and that's the important part, because I don't think the actual question really should be should you use an entity command buffer or not for a given case. It's more of a do I need to? Do I, in this specific case, am I forced into using an entity command buffer, or can I do an alternative that will be faster? So like what I see some beginners end up doing is like just schedule parallel, schedule everything, and that is slow, and that will, in a sad way, sadly force them to use entity command buffers, and that's not
Right,
really
right.
a place where entity command buffers should be used, and that is not like when you go to validate whether or not a given scenario you are forced into using an entity command buffer, you also have to take a step back and see if your current solution even needs multi-threading to begin with. Because the question is really, do you need multi-threading or not? If, say, you were only iterating over 100 entities, you can really just say, yeah, I'm going to do it on the main thread, and I'm going to use the entity manager. And when you do that, it's also more easy to see, oh, I probably shouldn't add a component to all these entities that happen to be in the same chunk. I should probably just batch up all the changes ahead of time and then instantiate all of them, or I should instantiate a new archetype that has everything set up, and then I can do an instantiate passing in the number of entities that you want to spawn that are correct, and just move all the data over. So really, the default should be entity manager, like pretty much always. But the ways you go to solve not using an entity command buffer is sometimes harder than it's worth. And if it is harder than it's worth, in those cases, you should also just use an entity command buffer. Like if you already have written out all the code for an entity command buffer and you don't really see a performance problem with an entity command buffer, it's not like it makes sense to stop you from doing it. But yeah, you should be careful of using them, especially if it's like, hey, I'm gonna add a component to 1,000 entities. That will just be slow, because it has to look at every command in that entity command buffer and then figure out what to do with it. And it has to do that 1,000 times. It can't just move all of them, and it can't just like ahead of time have a tight loop compiled, because you might have switched over to a different type of command. And so you also sometimes want to batch things into one native array that then does the operation, just because it means that the burst has already done a tighter loop. That being said, there's also this idea that you can't do any structural changes inside a main thread loop, which isn't really the case either. Like you can do entity manager dot create entity, you can do create archetype, and you can do instantiate. All of which work. So yeah, I think that's the basic gist of it.
So yeah, basically, I guess to kind of summarize, if I'm understanding correctly, it's kind of like, be cautious when you're doing, using parallel code in general. You may not necessarily always need it, But and then in the cases where you are using parallel code, then that might be an option for you to use an entity command buffer, because maybe there are some other ways to get the end result that you're looking for, but all that trouble is not necessarily worth what you would save by using something else. So feel free to use an entity command buffer
Yeah,
there.
yeah,
Right?
and also there is one case though that an entity command buffer will be faster, and it's one of the few cases which is just if something happens very rare, it is fine to add it to an entity command buffer. Like say you have a lifetime system and you're only expecting something to despawn once every few seconds, then it actually makes sense that you have a loop that checks over all the state, and only sometimes it adds it to a command buffer, because it means that you can have this tight loop that does the adding, and it doesn't try to do any sort of structural changes or storing an additional array, or like it will just sometimes call this secondary thing, and it can be put at a pre-sync point as to not cause any syncs to happen.
Right. Right. Yeah. And yeah, again, I think that's kind of like one of the reasons that I would maybe kind of gravitated towards using entity command buffers as well, is like trying to, avoid sync points at all costs. But, still, I think it might be okay to kind of, have some sync points in here and there, especially if it's like, something that you're not doing, all too often, like, maybe, every once in a while that you're kind of instantiating an entity, then it's like, yeah, it's okay if you enter a sync point kind of in the middle of like one frame, right?
Well, okay, it is about how big that sync point is going to be, definitely. Like that's another thing about systems also. A system doesn't necessarily have to create an entire sync point syncing everything, but
And so that would be like in regards to maybe like write dependencies or something like that, where like certain jobs that are accessing certain bits of data need to be completed, but it doesn't need to complete every single job that you're scheduling, right?
yeah.
Nice, sounds good to me. Well, do you have any other kind of tips or anything that you would like to add for when to use entity command buffers versus not?
I don't think so. Yeah, I think people should just default a lot more to main thread, and then at some point when they figure out there's a limitation, uh, then they should switch to a multi-threaded solution. And then at some point they might figure out, hey, all this entity command buffer instructions I'm doing in my job is actually costing us performance. In that case, I can just change my entity command buffer inside the job to a native array or a native list, and then put all my the entities that I want to change in there, and then after the job is complete, do the actual action.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach. So just kind of do it like a little bit more manually, like you're kind of taking control over, which entities you're modifying and how you're modifying in them and everything, right?
Yeah, and you're almost creating your own entity command buffer. You're just saying, hey, sometime later I'm gonna execute entity manager on this array of entities, or this set of queries. And that's
That makes
also, by the way,
sense.
another approach you can use. Often it can be a lot faster if you, in your job, because enableable components are not actually structural changes. It means that your parallel jobs can totally fine do a whole set of instructions. Like they can change a bunch of components to whether or not they're enabled, and
Right,
then
right.
later on you would have an entity manager with an add component passing in a query. And the good thing about passing in a query is that a query is archetype based, whereas a native array of entities is only entity based. So a native array of entities would still have to look up every single entity
Right.
in the
Yeah,
entity
you're still
store
having those
to figure
random
out the chunk.
lookups. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas if you just have an entity query, it can map that directly to the chunks and then do chunk level operations instead. And so by using enableable components, you can often end up in a place where you can use entity query operations instead.
That's a really good point. And then, so would you typically do something like that in a separate system, right? So you'd have kind of the first one that like schedules your parallel job, or maybe you're setting enable and disable components, or even adding them to a list if you want to go down that route. And then you'd have a separate system kind of later in the frame that like actually does all that processing, right?
Well, I actually have an example because it didn't make it into first episode, but I actually got it in like right after the episode. So I will just quickly.
Well,
Yeah,
shoot, while we're
it
talking
is on
about
my
it,
other
might as
screen.
well.
Might
Yeah,
as well.
something to show here, yeah.
There you go. Boom, boom. Yeah, so this is a little script of a lifetime system. There's a baker because that's a component called lifetime, and it just stores the amount of seconds left on an entity. Mm-hmm. It is an I-enableable component, and then we have a loop here. And the point of what we want this system to do is whenever this has, ticked down to 0, we just destroy the entity. So we have this tight little loop that will, every frame make sure to, as long as we have seconds left, take away some seconds. And as soon as we don't have any seconds left, we should change the state, which means that this will suddenly match. Like, notice one thing here. This can run every single frame because it doesn't really have any cost. Also, by the way, the cost here is currently the 2-entity array, but that is because there was a bug in this version. It was fixed in 1.2, as far as I recall. You don't actually need to pass in 2-entity array because that would be slower. But anyways, it means that notice now that you can just use a entity query, and so the destroy entity operation will work on all those chunks, and then look. It would still have to check individually when it reaches the chunk where the specific stuff has to move.
Right, right.
But yeah, this will still theoretically be faster.
Nice.
And this could just as well have been in a separate job running.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool. Well, that's awesome.